Good morning, everyone. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm one of the conveners of Battle of Ideas Festival. If you were here yesterday, welcome back. I hope you had a good day yesterday. I know it was busy, lots of interesting discussions. I hope you enjoyed it. And to anyone who's arrived today for their first day of the festival, then welcome to you too. Lots of very interesting discussions going on across the course of the day. So I hope you're looking forward to getting stuck in about all the discussions. So this first session of the Sunday of Battle of Ideas 2024 is Misinformation, the Battle for Free Speech Online. And I think it's quite remarkable the extent to which the misinformation question has come to the fore in so many aspects of life. I mean, even many of the significant societal events recently have if you take something like the riots over the summer in Britain or some of the discussion around the results of elections, most obviously the American election coming up, the extent to which misinformation plays into the discussion of those events is incredible, really. And quite often, recently, I think that discussion has revolved often around new technologies and the influence of things like social media, the internet. Now artificial intelligence plays into that discussion and all the challenges that they pose in terms of misinformation and their effect. I think also the response in official circles has been numerous initiatives at the level of law, sometimes policy, certainly in institutions and corporations, all aiming to control the sharing of information, which raises obviously a huge number of questions for anybody that's interested in freedom and free speech. And I think it's these sorts of things that we can try to take stock of in this session today, can ask the extent to which the threat of misinformation exists, how we deal with it, the extent to which we need to deal with it, what do we think about the ways that people are trying to deal with it, and I think a bigger question, what is driving our fears over misinformation and the responses to it, and how should we respond to that? So that's kind of what we want to get through this morning. Let me introduce my panel in the order that they're going to speak on, and actually they've remarkably, without my influence, lined up right the way along this table. So first of all, we'll hear from Dr. Dan Williams, who's a lecturer in philosophy at University of Sussex, where he researches topics such as misinformation, conspiracy theories, political irrationality. He's currently working on a couple of books, one of which is The Social Roots of Delusions. And he came to my attention, certainly, because he writes an excellent Substack, which I highly recommend that you look up. It's called Conspicuous Cognition. So that's Dan. Welcome to you, Dan. Secondly, we'll hear from Nico Perino. He's Executive Vice President of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. And FIRE are a sponsor for this session. In fact, they're a sponsor partner for all the discussions in this room all the way through today about free speech. It's brilliant to be able to bring Nico and his colleagues from FIRE across from America and to have them as part of the festival. So really pleased to have you here. Nico is the host of FIRE, so to speak, the Free Speech podcast, which if you haven't come across it, I highly recommend it. Very excellent podcast. And he's a writer. And also I'd mentioned that he's the co-director and senior producer of a film called Mighty Ira, which is very worthwhile looking out as well. And you can I think, get to that through Amazon and yes. All popular outlets. On my immediate left, we've got Tamandra Harkness, who's a journalist, writer, and broadcaster. She's the author of a recently published book called Technology is Not the Problem. She's a presenter on Radio 4 of programs like Future Proofing and How to Disagree, and you can find her in numerous media outlets. And she does all sorts of various things, including once upon a time, she was, and if you can get your head around this, half of the very first UK comedy science double act. Welcome, Samandra. On my immediate right, we've got Eli Vieira. Very pleased to welcome Eli all the way from Brazil. He flew over a few days ago. He's a journalist. He's the editor of Gazeta do Povo, which I probably I've mispronounced, but you might just about understand that. Along with Michael Schellenberger and others, he was very much behind the Twitter Files Brazil. You've probably heard of the Twitter Files, I would imagine. There was a Brazilian version which had an enormous influence in terms of the discussion around social media in Brazil. And he's soon to be releasing his first book called More Equal Than Others, Identity Without Identitarianism. Welcome. Thank you. Fraser Myers, finally, on my far right. Excuse me. Deputy editor of the online magazine Spiked, host of the Spiked podcast, who are here and have a podcast this afternoon down on the lower ground floor in the Robert Runce's room, so you might want to go to that. He campaigns for democracy and free speech, appears in numerous media outlets, and he's a long-term speaker at Battle of Ideas. We always really like having Fraser back to speak and chair on sessions. So, can we give them a warm welcome, please? You know the score by now. 5-6 minutes of introductions, straight out to you as an audience for some questions, and then we'll get a discussion going like that. So, Dan, over to you.
Thanks. So since 2016, the year of two surprising populist revolts, first Brexit in this country and then the election of Donald Trump in the US, members of what you might call the liberal establishment in Western countries have been gripped by an intense, very well-documented panic about online misinformation. And according to the narrative driving this panic, that I think will be familiar to most people here, maybe some of you endorse it, a recent explosion of false and incendiary content online, fueled by sinister politicians, pundits, and algorithms, is infecting people's minds, amplifying division and distrust, and driving the public to make bad decisions, like voting for demagogues and rejecting public health advice. This narrative was on full, almost comical display earlier this year, when the World Economic Forum, that's the people at Davos, drew on advice from 1,500 experts worldwide to list misinformation and disinformation as the number one, the top global risk over the next 2 years, ahead of military conflict, economic catastrophe, nuclear war, and so on. Like most popular narratives, I think this one does contain an important grain of truth. It would be absurd to deny that online misinformation sometimes creates real problems. And we can all think of examples like the role of fake news in the race riots earlier this year in this country. Nevertheless, I think this grain of truth in popular discourse tends to get buried under a mountain of alarmism, fuzzy thinking, and self-serving spin. And I want to make just two really brief points. First, although online misinformation is clearly sometimes a problem, misinformation, in the sense of people being wrong about things, either deliberately or accidentally, has always been a problem. So lies, propaganda, unfounded conspiracy theories, self-serving ideologies, also just plain old human fallibility, these things are as old as humanity, and contrary to popular belief, there's no reason to think, and there's no evidence that social media has made these things worse on average. Moreover, the most dangerous forms of misinformation inevitably come from people in positions of power, so political, cultural, economic elites, who've got every incentive to depict themselves as objective, honest truth-tellers, in contrast with the misinformed masses on social media. Obviously, that's not to say social media has no detrimental consequences when it comes to public discourse, right? Clearly, democratizing the public sphere, loosening the grip of elite gatekeepers, as social media has done, was always going to produce a complex mix of benefits and costs. So to take just one example, the much greater scope for dissent from establishment orthodoxies that I think social media provides can be a blessing and a curse. Right? It depends on the quality of those orthodoxies and the nature and quality of the dissent. The point is just that contrasting a mythical golden age of truth and objectivity with a kind of digital post-truth apocalypse doesn't illuminate those effects. It obscures them in ways that I think ultimately benefit the interests of elites and establishment institutions. The second point that I want to make, just briefly, is again, contrary to popular belief, research suggests that when it comes to clear-cut, unambiguous online misinformation, things like fake news or deepfakes, It's relatively rare within the informational ecosystem and is not a significant driver of social and political trends. So for example, a study published in Science in 2020, that's one of the world's leading scientific journals, estimates that fake news makes up roughly 0.15% of America's average media diet, overall media diet, and that's a finding replicated in many other studies in many Western countries, including this one. Moreover, another robust finding is that engagement with that really clear-cut online misinformation is highly concentrated among a sort of narrow fringe of social media users that seek it out because it aligns with their pre-existing beliefs. And that sounds very sort of abstract and academic, but to make it concrete, you can go back to the riots earlier this summer and ask who are the people who were eagerly spreading an unfounded, evidence-free, incendiary rumor that the killer was a Muslim asylum seeker. Narrow fringe of social media users with strong distrust of institutions and pre-existing animosity towards Muslims and asylum seekers. The fact that online misinformation preaches to the choir in that way, to people who are already predisposed to accept it, obviously doesn't mean it has no harmful consequences, as those riots illustrate, but it does suggest it's symptomatic of much deeper problems, attitudes, divisions within society. And what that means is trying to deal with those problems by combating online misinformation is a bit like trying to cure a brain tumor by taking painkillers to deal with the headaches that it produces. And I would say that's part of the attraction of modern misinformation alarmism. It takes these complex, difficult social and political problems, many of them caused or exacerbated by establishment failures, and transforms them into a simple, neat, technocratic problem of combating online misinformation. But I'd say it's even worse than that, because as we're probably going to talk about this morning, many of the proposed solutions to the problem of online misinformation involve calls for much greater top-down censorship. And censorship, which will be implemented by fallible, biased human beings, is likely to exacerbate those problems of institutional distrust and social division that give rise to a market for online misinformation in the first place. So just to sort of really briefly wrap up, it would be nice to believe that combating online misinformation could return us all to a sort of pre-digital golden age of truth and objectivity. But not only does that golden age never exist, but many of the real problems of misinformation that we confront today are much more often reflected on social media rather than rooted in it. Thank you.
Fantastic start. Thanks, Dan. Nico.
Yeah, I want to pick up a little bit where Dan left off. Dan mentioned alarmism, and we definitely have that in the misinformation and disinformation debate in America. Americans are more concerned about mis and disinformation than they are sexism, racism, terrorism, climate change. They are of one mind, I guess, here with the World Economic Forum, as Dan was speaking about. And 55% of Americans say that government should take steps to restrict misinformation. And this is up from 38% in 2018. But when you ask Americans where the biggest cause for concern surrounding misinformation is, they'll say it's politicians spreading misinformation, right? So they want the government to take steps to regulate misinformation. I don't know who they think in government is going to be doing that, if not the politicians that they think are the biggest spreaders of misinformation. So our debate surrounding mis and disinformation can be a little bit schizophrenic. Let's accept the premise that mis and disinformation is problematic. Dan cited a statistic I was going to cite, right? That misinformation makes up 0.15% of the media diet that Americans consume. I think this room probably isn't representative of most Americans. Most Americans spend less than 10 minutes a day consuming news at all, right? But even if the news they are consuming is incorrect, I don't think that justifies the government then coming in to police it. This is the country of George Orwell in 1984. That book was a cautionary tale, not an instruction manual. Winston Smith, of course, the main character in that book, worked at the Ministry of Truth. And so the only institution that you can set up to really regulate this would be perhaps the government, and it would have to set up a Ministry of Truth, right? How else would you determine what is true or false? There was a viral tweet that just went around of this prominent political commentator in the United States saying that the misinformation debate has gotten so out of control, that our political ecosystem is so rife with lies, that the government needs to step in and police it. And one of my colleagues retweeted, I don't know what you call it now that it's called X, reposted it, I guess, and said, okay, sir, who would you have Donald Trump appoint to do this very important job, right? Misinformation and disinformation has been used to justify censorship from time immemorial, right? It was the Nazis who were setting up censorship commissions to police Jewish lies or Marxist propaganda. You got Stalin, for example, policing counter-revolutionary ideas and false information. China, North Korea, Russia right now with the war in Ukraine. This has always been the justification for censorship. We are in a new anarchic period after the rise of new and emerging technologies, social media, the internet, artificial intelligence. The solution is increased media literacy, as it has always been. The New York Times ran a broadside in 1858 talking about a new technology of the time, characterizing it as superficial, sudden, unsifted, too fast for truth. What was this technology? The telegraph. We are always concerned that new technologies are going to make it hard for us to determine truth from falsity. We had this with the printing press, as my colleague Greg Lukianoff, who was just up on the stage before me, likes to talk about. You get the printing press, then you get the Reformation, then you get the 30 Years' War, and then you get 8 million dead in Europe. Now, terrible, right? Europe had unsettled the truth that it had long known, the Catholic truth that it had long known, and 8 million people died. But are we worse off today for having the printing press? These are the trade-offs of new technology. In 1912, you had a law that was being proposed in Congress in the United States, policing manipulated photographs, because people were doing the analog version of Photoshop, whereby they'd put their photo next to then President Howard Taft's photo, and Congress was up in arms over this. You had the War of the Worlds controversy, where Orson Welles had a radio broadcast talking about an alien invasion of New York, and people believed it, and there was chaos in Times Square. With the rise of the internet, I used to receive emails from Nigerian princes promising me millions of dollars. At first I was like, wait, really? I have a long-lost brother in Nigeria who wants to give me millions of dollars? No. I eventually developed the media literacy to understand what email was fake and what was a scam. Ultimately, what I think it comes down to, the problem, is that misinformation, lies, are tools that people use to reinforce their political identities. Rather than persuade people of fact. So they will cling to this misinformation, this lie, this untruth, even in the absence of knowledge, because of our polarized situation. And I don't think having the government come in and then determine what is true and false is going to solve that. I think it is going to amplify it and increase the polarization that is the root cause.
Thank you very much, Nico. Tamandra.
Well, I was just saying that I was worried that I'll have nothing left to say after Dan and Nico had spoken, and I fear that is that is slightly going to be the truth. But maybe I'll start from a slightly different direction. I think that one of the problems in talking about this is that misinformation and disinformation are really unhelpful categories and words that we should avoid using, really, because to talk about misinformation and disinformation, which sometimes are divided according to, is this, are you just mistaken? Are you mistakenly sharing something that isn't true? Or are you deliberately spreading something that's untrue? Presupposes that there is an unproblematic category called information, which is neutral, which is certain, and which comes with no assumptions or agenda. And I think anyone with the slightest ounce of, not even media literacy, but like experience of human communication knows that that's a very, very rare thing. So for that reason, I think misinformation and disinformation should immediately be suspect as descriptions of human communication, because they try and establish that there is this other thing that we're trying to get back to, this golden age of pure information, which is entirely neutral and shared. But also, if you use the word, you're immediately telling anybody who was the slightest bit open to even considering the content of the misinformation that they are at best gullible and at worst malign. The stupid, ignorant or evil, I think, is the phrase that's often used. And coming at this from the perspective of actually wanting to engage in debate online as well as everywhere else, the first thing I would say was, if you want to change somebody's mind, then you have to start with them and with the assumption that they are a rational being and that they have reasons for believing whatever it is they believe or are open to believing, and engage with them on that level. So as soon as you've labelled something misinformation, you've basically told them that this is an unreasonable thing to even entertain believing, and that what they should do is fall in line with you and what you think is true or certain. So to pick up on what's the problem with online discussion, debate, where online disagreements go wrong, and in fact to pick up on some of the things that Nico was just saying, the online disagreements are often polarised and hostile, and we lack a shared ground on which to disagree. That is partly factual, hence is this information or misinformation division, but also partly in terms of simply what are the rules of engagement here, what do we think are reasonable ways to engage with people that you disagree with, is there a common language? So it's not only do we have a shared picture of what the world is actually like, do we have a shared picture of how we should disagree with each other and how we should hash out arguments, and we often don't. And this is this is the polarisation that has already been mentioned, which is absolutely not helped by labelling what you disagree with as misinformation. That just exacerbates polarisation. But again, and picking up on the things that have already been said, this polarisation precedes social media. It wasn't invented by social media. The polarisation was already happening. And I'd like actually to talk a little bit about some very good research by Professor Chris Bale at Duke University, who runs a thing called the Polarisation Lab, where he woke up very surprised in 2016 because Trump had been elected, and thought, well, that's a surprise. Nobody I knew or followed on social media was going to vote for Trump. And with admirable intellectual humility, he said, well, I must have been doing something wrong then, because clearly millions of people did vote for him. So he went out with first of all, with the working assumption that the problem was echo chambers, and did some research. And then when COVID happened and people went very online, saw an opportunity to do some research with volunteers, found people with relatively polarised political views, not necessarily extreme, and exposed them to opposing views online. And contrary to what he expected, which is that their echo chambers would be opened up and they would start to see each other's point of view more, he found they entrenched more. They actually became more polarised in the sense that he calls false polarisation, which is that they didn't necessarily change their views all that much, but their perception of the other side hardens, that they felt the other side was more extreme than they were, in fact, and that the other side was more hostile to them than they were. And this was mutual, this was on both sides. And also affective polarisation, which is their feelings towards the other side hardened up. And he realised that what happens when you go online is not that you're trying to have a conversation, you're trying to establish your own identity and your political identity and your group identity, and so you perceive disagreement as an attack. And so, in fact, trying to expose people to other views without addressing that was not going to do anything at all. So this is why I think looking at the nature of social media is not really helpful, because the nature of social media responds to these trends, which again precedes social media. The perception across political divides, and it's definitely more extreme in the US, but it's also present here. The The idea, for example, that you don't want to be friends with someone who politically disagrees with you is getting stronger and stronger, or the idea that you wouldn't want a child of yours marrying across the political divide is getting stronger and stronger. I remember being struck after 2016 that both Leave and Remain voters said that they wouldn't. I think about half of the Leave voters said they wouldn't want a child of theirs marrying a Remain voter, and about 70% of the Remain voters said they wouldn't want their child marrying the Leave voter, which is often seems to be the case, that the supposedly more liberal side of a divide is actually much more emotionally hostile to any kind of family links. So, I mean, to sum up really, and to disappointingly perhaps agree with the two previous speakers, these are problems. It's not that it's not a problem, but they're problems that don't originate in the nature of online interaction. And to address them through addressing the technology and the nature of online interaction and the content of online interaction would only exacerbate the problems, because the lack of trust in expertise, in authority, in institutions certainly precedes social media and the technology. And the polarization across political divides also precedes the technology. And again, just to echo what's already been said, trying to enforce what is true and what's untrue, what's information and what's misinformation, would only exacerbate that sense of distrust of authority and polarization. And finally, I'd just like to end with the people in good faith trying to police misinformation should remember Cromwell's law, which is, I beseech you, my lords, in the bowels of Christ, to consider the possibility that you may be wrong.
Thanks, Jamandra. I think that's useful to raise the questions about how it is that you deal with some of this stuff, regardless of the agreement position. Eli, your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Alistair. Good morning. So I come from the country that won a dispute with Elon Musk. And the left is quite exultant about it. So someone finally put that billionaire in his place. But is it a victory, though, for democracy, as they say? I'd say no. So in April, I was, as Alistair said, I worked on the Twitter Files Brazil. And to summarize what we found, so this judge who won the dispute with Musk, Alexandre de Moraes, at the time he's in the Supreme Court, and at the time he was the president of the Superior Electoral Tribunal. So Brazil has this weird system where elections are overseen by this section of the judiciary. And while president there, he tried to we saw these documents, which were internal emails from legal counsel in Twitter. So this judge tried to extract personal data against the law from hundreds of thousands of Brazilians just because they posted a hashtag asking the voting machines to leave a printout when you vote. So Brazil uses this very centralized electronic voting system that is only found in Bhutan, nowhere else. And people, well, especially the right and Bolsonaro, of course, they are suspicious of the system. And maybe it's okay that they are, but of course, they are not right, I think, when they say there was electoral fraud. There was fraud in 2022 when Lula was elected as president for a third term. But in counting the votes, and in this country that you do it very quickly, and you don't need the machines, so I just wonder whether the machines are necessary. And they have this code of hundreds of thousands of lines, and what passes for a check on it is that some programmers are invited, and they have 15 minutes to look at it with a pencil and paper. So yeah, I could see why half of the Brazilian electorate is suspicious of these machines. So yeah, they wanted to censor people who said that the elections could not be trusted, the results could not be trusted. And Bolsonaro himself was convicted, and he cannot run for office for 8 years. And guess who did that? Alexandre de Moraes again, presiding over the electoral cut. And now Twitter is back to Brazil, and it's proof that Elon Musk caved, because the only way he could come back to Brazil was by obeying the order, which is an illegal order, to censor about 300 Brazilians. So it's the first time Brazil has exiles, political exiles, since the 1970s, and they became exiles first online. Their accounts were banned in Brazil. You can see them, you can look at what they're tweeting, but not in Brazil. So VPN is becoming a very popular tool to Brazilians now. So, and all of this was done in the name of fighting misinformation and disinformation. And in Portuguese, these are the same word. I guess that means intent doesn't even matter. Right? You only have to spout something that is false, reveals to be false, and then you could be, under Moraes's, control. And Brazilians did fight back. There was this law, the fake news bill. It was about to be passed by Congress. And then we did the unthinkable. We saw it and we said, that's censorship. So only by calling it censorship repeatedly and showing it was so, we stopped it. So it was an emergency vote. It was stopped. And then I became worried, and that's when I contacted Michael Schellenberger to start our work. But then Moraes, while president of this superior electoral cut, he rummaged through the rubbish bin of the Congress, and he reinstated this bill as a Kurt's resolution. So, and he claims to do all of this in the name of democracy, protecting free speech. In his 51-page decision that banned Twitter in Brazil, can you guess which philosopher he quoted, Dan? Can you guess which philosopher he quoted? Mill. So the harm principle, Mill's harm principle, was used in Brazil to ban a social media platform. Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. Maybe we're going to need more lessons from how you're fighting back in Brazil if things continue to go this way in the UK and Europe. Yeah. Fraser, finally your remarks, please.
Do we have any fans of the BBC's Mariana Spring in the audience? We'll come on to her later. But first of all, I just want to underline what people have been saying, that 2016 really is the year zero for the misinformation, disinformation, panic. I mean, Google has this really nice tool called Ngrams, and you can put in a word and you can see the frequency with which that word is used. And if you search for misinformation and disinformation, I mean, it absolutely explodes around 2016, the Brexit and Trump year. It's a word that is used hardly ever. And then it just, is on sort of everyone's lips, and you can see it's used in newspapers, in books, in all kinds of things. And obviously, as has been alluded to, this is part of the fact that pretty wounded elite is struggling to make sense of why the little people haven't followed their instructions. The political bent of this is also clear in the rise of the kind of fact-checking industry. I mean, everywhere you go, there are people asserting themselves as fact-checkers. But it was interesting, the Washington Post stopped its its presidential fact-checking service 100 days after Joe Biden's election. It didn't feel the need to check the president's facts anymore. During Joe Biden's inauguration, the founder of Vox tweeted that it was nice not to have to fact-check what the president was saying. I think one of the key things here to underline is it's not really about what is being said, but who is saying it and why. What is the political bent behind it? Misinformation is tolerated if it serves an establishment cause, sneered at if it doesn't. I mean, you can literally see the same thing be declared true or false depending on whose mouth it comes out of. So, in early 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, think about something like the lab leak theory. That was censored across social media, as a racist conspiracy theory, suppressed on Facebook, suppressed on YouTube, then again, Donald Trump's out of office, the Biden administration suggests, maybe there's something to it. Suddenly it's not misinformation anymore. Suddenly it's plausible and something that we can talk about. The BBC is a big offender in this regard, and there we come on to Mariana Spring. She's the social media and disinformation specialist correspondent. Most of her articles are about herself, but she does spread a fair bit of mis and disinformation, and mostly in relation to the misinformation panic, ironically. So according to Mariana Spring and the BBC, 1 in 4 Britons believe that COVID was a hoax. Think about that for a second. 1 in 4 Britons think it was a hoax. Not that they disagree with lockdowns, are a bit iffy about the vaccine, literally think the whole thing was fake and made up. According to Mariana Spring, 7% of Britons have attended a protest related to COVID or 15-minute cities. 7%. Now, to visualize that, that's around 3.4 million people. That would have been the biggest protest movement of all time, raging against 15-minute cities and various traffic calming measures. It's just these kinds of figures wouldn't pass the sniff test in an ordinary editorial conversation, let alone make it through the fact checker, the specialist disinformation reporter. So clearly there is a desire to exaggerate the scale of this problem, to suggest that free speech is getting out of hand. The traditional gatekeepers need to come back and reassert what is true and what is good and what is holy. And, as I was suggesting earlier, the fact-checking spotlight doesn't ever really shine on their favoured causes. The BBC, I've got to love the BBC, but it has made entire documentaries about men getting pregnant. I don't have to explain to you why that is not something that is real. BBC is very exercised about misinformation about the climate, but it never really challenges anything on the alarmist spectrum. So, for instance, recent Panorama claimed that more people are dying every year from extreme weather. This is a very easy fact to look up. Less people are dying every year from extreme weather. That's not to say that climate change isn't real, but, facts are facts, you'd have thought. You think we should be worried probably about alarmism on that topic? More than half of teenagers believe that the world will end in their lifetime. That seems to me to be something that, people who are interested in facts and the truth ought to challenge and take to task. I'll end on a funny little twist to Mariana Spring's own story, because last year it emerged that she had been lying on her CV. So she actually, she claimed she'd worked with BBC Russia correspondent Sarah Rainsford and had never had any contact with her at all. So she disinfoed her way into the job as the specialist information reporter. Is it really the truth that we're talking about here? Is that really what this conversation is about? Or is this is less about, I would say, less about disinformation that people are worried about than disfavoured information?
Okay, thanks very much, Fraser. Okay, so that was very useful introductions, I think. I want to come out now to you for your points and questions. The one thing I want to say just before I do that is, obviously, to a large extent, the people up here in the panel have downplayed the consequences of misinformation. I thought Dan and Nico very well set out some of the facts and figures about it. But if you're someone that thinks that even although misinformation in the terms of volume of misinformation is fairly minor, but you're more concerned about the practical consequences of it. So, for example, if you think it's wrong to downplay it in terms of its influence on the riots, or you think that when people burned down 5G wireless masts a few years ago, that was an important consequence of misinformation, or if you think that something like the information going around on vaccines has had a consequence in terms of people not going for medical treatments. So if you think that the consequences of misinformation are being downplayed here, even although, despite what Nico and Dan have said is true, then feel free to challenge some of our speakers on that, and let's get a conversation going on this. I think there's also interesting questions in terms of what's driving this whole misinformation conversation. Tamandra raised some very useful questions in terms of how you deal with it from the polarization perspective. And I think there is with some of the initiatives that are on the horizon, for example, through things like the European Union and its Digital Services Act, and how we're going to deal, or how those in authority want to deal with it, there's some very important questions about how it is that we respond to some of these things. That's just a few thoughts about things that you might want to raise in the discussion. So, have I got some microphones somewhere? Yes, so do you just want to hand it there, and where's the other one? If you just go to the middle there, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst who 25 years ago used to teach the John F. Kennedy case as a training course, and more or less had to give up on that because too many of the people participating had swallowed the conspiracy theory nonsense. So it was around then, before the internet, of course, and the damage was huge. My question for you all is, are there any particular issues, subjects, which you think we should particularly pay attention to in the next, say, 12 months or so? And what about disinformation and misinformation by omission, where issues are simply not mentioned when you would expect them to be mentioned? An obvious one I'm thinking on is the issue of a possible leak from the lab in Wuhan. Thank you.
Okay, if you can hand that microphone to the guy on the end. Yes, someone up here's got one. Yes.
Hi. Unfortunately, Fraser actually commented on a couple of things I wanted to ask about, but I'm going to head and talk about them anyway. With the Wuhan lab leaks, at first it was misinformation, then disinformation, but really it was unapproved information. They didn't want to talk about it, therefore they mislabeled it on purpose. My second part is, how do we fight back against this kind of thing?
Okay, thank you. Good question. Yes, and if the other microphone can go to the back row.
Yeah, so I think there should be a distinction made between private censorship and government censorship. So from a free speech advocate's perspective, private censorship should be allowed, and I don't understand its demonization, because that itself is an exercise of free speech. So when you see private social media platforms like Twitter and Meta banning people because maybe they say mean stuff or they deem it misinformation, that should be allowed, and that exercise of bias should be allowed in private spheres. If I walk into a communist building and they find out I'm not a communist, they should have every right to kick me out. If someone walks into my house and says they like pineapples on pizza, I'm going to tell them to get out. So it's all just an exercise of free speech, and private censorship itself is also an exercise of free speech.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So, since we're talking about free speech, I have the right to give my own opinion. So as a fellow Brazilian, I must say, and again, this is my opinion, I am ashamed of some of the things you said, and I'll tell you why. The people here know nothing about Brazil, and they know nothing about Brazilian elections or Brazilian anything. So the only thing they will get out of this, what you said here, is that the elections are rigged, which I'm sorry.
I did not say that.
You gave them enough information that all they know is that the only other country that uses the machines is Bhutan. So if you ask the people here, probably 80% will think that it's rigged, and they will think that Brazil is a country that doesn't allow free speech. Again, I actually have... I'm allowed to say as well that I think Elon Musk, for certain things, should be stopped exactly for this reason, because the people, unfortunately, in this world, most people are clueless, and they hear just a few things, they don't go deep. So there are certain things that people should not be told because they are just factually wrong. Just think about Trump and the people eating dogs. So the elections are not rigged, and Bolsonaro should be in jail for a lot of things he did, including January 8th. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, we come back on that when we get some responses. So there must be a microphone, yes.
Yes, I want to ask, is debate being shut down, it's kind of connected to what she's saying in some ways, by attack on our pub culture, closing down of our community spaces?
Okay, and one final one for just now, right at the back.
I want to express my grateful thanks to the lady next to me for being told I'm too stupid and ignorant to be informed of anything and that I should be kept in the dark. Thank you so much. Really appreciated a really super advert for free speech.
Okay, thank you. So let me come back and pick up some responses. Let's go, Fraser, actually, go to you first. Is there anything that you want to pick up on in terms of those questions?
Yeah, a couple of quick things. Private versus government censorship. I'm not sure it's free speech to suppress other people's free speech. It might be the free market. But I think the two things are not as distinct as many people believe. I mean, a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, a lot of things revealed in the Twitter files actually was showing that, government and big private firms work hand in glove to decide what should be censored. So I don't think that you can actually draw a clear line. Obviously, private firms have their own interests in censoring things that might be controversial and might look bad for advertisers. But a lot, they're not. These are not as clear cut as you might think. Should we be worried about conspiracy theories, things like that? I would say yes. I don't think that rejecting the disinformation panic as it's been constructed, as people have shown that it is exaggerated, doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about finding the truth and seeking the truth. I think what worries me is that the way that we go about tackling disinformation in today's age, or these sort of specialist disinformation agencies and reporters, is actually, almost actually the opposite of truth-seeking. So a lot of the time you go on a, sort of fact check on the BBC, or, what do they do to say that something's false? They talk to Dr. Henry Brubaker of the Institute of Studies, and he says it's false, so it must be false. Which is basically, as people know, that's just an appeal to authority. That's the opposite of the actual truth-seeking method. So really, ironically, one of the problems is that the disinformation panic is actually hindering the search for truth, which surely, people might know, is an ongoing process. One of the things about the scientific method is that it is not about appealing to any one person, or the Royal Society's great slogan is "on the word of no one." But how can we have that truth-seeking process where ideas clash, things are exposed, things are, some bad ideas fall out, some good ideas rise to the top, if we're told immediately that that something is just disinformation that has to be silenced?
Okay, Nico and Eli, I wanted to pick up on the point about Trump at the back, because it is so often the case, isn't it, and from the Brazilian context or the American context, that when these incidents happen, such as the eating of the dogs thing, which is obviously bad, but they become very high profile and do the rounds, and they might be a kind of isolated incident and quite a small incident in and of themselves, but they have a much bigger effect in terms of the discussion that they create politically. So is there not something in this question of misinformation really genuinely being a problem?
Well, yeah, there could be. But the question is, what do you do about it? You let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. And while truth might lose out in the short term, I think we now sort of have an understanding, or more fulsome understanding, of that conversation. There was a question over here about misinformation by omission. And I think you can only ever really trust the outcome of any process if you think that process itself is fair, right? So in the criminal context, right? You go through a trial, a defendant stands trial, the jury renders a verdict, and you can agree with that verdict if you feel that the trial itself was fair, Well, the same thing with our public discussion. If you think our public discussion was fair, you're going to trust the outcome of that public discussion. A public discussion is never fair if there is censorship. If certain information or contributions to that discussion are omitted. And I think that's why there was so much distrust in our institutions after COVID, because there were certain things that simply could not be said. And so people didn't trust the public order laws, or they didn't trust the censorship, for example, that happened on social media, because they just didn't believe it, because contrary opinions weren't allowed to be shared. Now, on the topic of private censorship that was brought up earlier, I 100% agree with you. Yes, and this is the challenge, right, is that you have private institutions that themselves have their own First Amendment right to organize around shared values. There is a movement by people who are concerned about cancel culture, like I am, right, that in order to fight back against culture, we need to then pass laws that prohibit employers from firing people based on belief. Well, that is going to be a disaster for mission and cause-based organizations, including organizations like FIRE, because what's going to happen is it's going to be wielded by people who have a political axe to grind to essentially destroy the organizations that employ them. We see this in the United States. The Intercept ran this great long feature story about how some of the reproductive rights organizations in the United States have been completely captured by activists who have political and racial grievances. These organizations have been rendered ill-functional. Right? Now in the United States, you have at-will employment. These people can be fired, and they're not, and largely because of what people perceive, the leaders perceive to be the political ramifications for that. But if you create a law that prevents them from being fired, that's going to be a problem. That's how you get a situation whereby Elon Musk can't fire 80% of Twitter staff because they no longer align with the mission of the organization. You wouldn't have someone like Brian Armstrong of Coinbase, for example, saying that we're here and we're an exchange for Bitcoin and for other cryptocurrencies, and that's what our mission is, and we're not going to do politics anymore. He issued this after the controversies in 2020. So I am very, very concerned about the idea of the government coming in and saying private organizations organized around shared values or a shared mission can't then fire employees who want to turn their workplaces into a political grievance for them. So.
Okay, I'm going to come to Mandra and Dan in a minute on questions like bias and stuff like that, which I think you might take on. But Eli, respond if you want
Sure.
to the point at the back, but just kind of also the question as to, why it is that Musk ultimately conceded. Why couldn't you win that fight?
So I welcome the challenge from my fellow Brazilian who committed misinformation against me. I said explicitly, and you might remember, that I don't believe there was any fraud in the elections. However, if half the electorate distrusts the system, the democratic thing to do is to listen to them and not to try to shut them up, like Alexandre de Moraes is trying to do. And you mentioned that I might be being biased in the way I'm picking and choosing information for our fellow British and American participants here. Well, let me give them more information then. So one of the Brazilian exiles in the US, this free speech exile, is a podcaster. His name is Monarch, that's his nickname. His real name is Bruno Ayub. He committed no crime, but to say that he said the same thing that Greg Lukianoff said this morning here, that he thinks even Nazis have free speech. And for that opinion, if I say that in a very popular podcast, he became a target for Alexandre de Moraes. He's now in the US. And last week, he was convicted. So if he was in Brazil, he would be in prison now for a year and a half for calling a Supreme Court judge a fatso. And this guy is a fatso. So Brazil does not have free speech. The gold standard for free speech is the American one. And as soon as Brazil realizes that, and the left, which is the problem now, which supports censorship, realizes that, we are going on being the joke of the world. And Alexandre de Moraes, our emperor.
Okay, Dan, anything that you wanted to pick up on there?
I guess I'll say a couple of things. You characterize me as saying misinformation is not a problem, and I think that really depends on what we mean by misinformation. So in my opening remarks, what I said was if you focus on really clear-cut unambiguous cases of online misinformation, like fake news, deepfakes, I think there is a kind of moral panic about that kind of content that's not supported by the evidence. But if you're focusing on misleading communication in a much broader sense, like, of course that's a problem in modern society. I definitely don't think the government should be stepping in to censor that kind of content, but it is a big issue. But it gets at really complex philosophical questions about what we even mean by misinformation. So if you focus on even mainstream news media, setting aside all ideological and partisan biases, it reports on a non-random sample of all of the bad things happening in the world at a given moment in time. That's very misleading. We know that that means audiences end up with very catastrophic pictures of the way the world works. Does that mean all of news media is misinformation? If you define misinformation as misleading content, you end up in that kind of position. So I think the problem with this term is, what are we focusing on? Are we focusing on something really clear-cut and unambiguous, or are we focusing on something really expansive, where I think decisions about whether something is going to be misinformation or not will be subject to much more sort of subjectivity and bias?
Would you go as far as Samandra, just get rid of the terms and something else?
I think if you're going to keep the terms, it's important that they have a very narrow scope. And I think at the moment, if you look at the sort of anti-misinformation industry, there's this real concept creep. So if you focus, for example, on vaccine content, there was a study that came out recently showing that on Facebook, the kind of content that was really impactful in influencing people's vaccination attitudes was not fake news. It was true stories of people who got vaccinated and then suffered consequences afterwards. And that was not fact-checked as false, and it was often run by mainstream media outlets. And there's this push to say, well, even that content should be labeled misinformation because it might mislead people about the dangers of vaccines. And I would say if you start going down that route and classifying true content as misinformation, just because it's misleading, you're going to end up in some pretty weird places.
Yeah, good. I have to say I was doing my best not to mischaracterize you, but to open the discussion up to questions that might be a bit more disagreeable. But Tamandra, your points.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd like to pick up on somebody at the back said, oh, I've just been, accused of being stupid and gullible. And I think, I mean, perhaps to echo what Dan said in a slightly different way, I think the problem with misleading information or information that's not true or that gives, if you like, a misleading impression of the world by not having the right context is not that people are gullible. And in fact, people are less gullible than we think, although that kind of implies that we're gullible for thinking that they are. There's a lovely, lovely book called Not Born Yesterday by Hugo Mercier, which started off as a paper where he and Dan Sperber analysed how much people believed untrue things and found that actually mostly people don't tend to believe untrue things. And if anything, we are rather over-sceptical about changing our minds. We believe things that reinforce what we already thought, but not new stuff. And he said over 10 years, people kept writing to him saying, you say that, but what about this example? And he kept looking at the examples until he ended up with a whole book's worth of stuff saying, actually, people are surprisingly ungullible. And even if you look at things like Pizzagate in America, where a guy turned up with a gun to a pizza shop saying, I'm here to rescue the children that are being held in the basement in a sex dungeon by Hillary Clinton. And Hugo Mercier said, listen, if all the people who claimed to believe Pizzagate really believed it, why was he the only one who turned up to rescue the children, right? If they really believed that was happening, they would have acted on it. But people don't tend to believe this stuff in that practical sense. So the problem is not that people are gullible and easily misled by untrue information. The real problem is that we lack a shared picture of the world, and without a shared picture of the world, it's really, really hard to resolve things by public discourse and disagreement. I mean, I had this recently talking to a friend about the news, and he said, you've just swallowed Israeli propaganda. And this is a well-informed, intelligent friend who's interested in politics. And I thought, how do I start here? Where do I go to find some kind of shared source of information that we can both agree is reasonably reliable and truthful from which to start a conversation here. So it is a problem that we do not have a shared source, that we lack shared sources that we can start from to have disagreements. But the answer to that, as others have said, is not censorship by some of the very people who we don't trust to give us truthful answers, especially when they are themselves as much driven by agendas and priorities and wanting to put forward narratives as anybody else. I've heard it argued that we shouldn't talk about misinformation, disinformation, but we should talk about misleading narratives. But then the logical outcome of that would be, who's going to censor the narratives? And that's, if anything, worse, I think, than pointing to a factual piece of information saying, well, I can actually demonstrate that that's not true, or that if you put this in context, it doesn't mean what you think it means.
Okay, so coming out to you again for more questions. So where are the microphones? So can you give it to the guy at the back who had his hand up for ages? And there's someone down the front here. So at the back, yes.
Hi there. Focusing on the UK context specifically, based on the rhetoric and responses to this summer's riots, I was wondering what the panel thought about the likelihood of the government trying to reintroduce the legal but harmful speech clause into the Online Safety Act.
Legal but harmful. On the online harms bill you're talking about. Nico, Eli, especially, there might be a bit of explanation there in terms of this is a bill or an act that's gone through to protect young people from online harms, which I'm sure you've got equivalent discussions going on in America, certainly, and Brazil. So, down the front.
Yeah,
yes.
It's the Online Safety Act, by the way. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's been accused of being a bot for holding a good faith opinion that someone doesn't believe someone could possibly hold. But I do want to ask if there's a problem with automation. So there's something called the dead internet theory, which is a buzzword at the moment. And in its purest form, it's completely bonkers. And it claims the internet died in 2016. But there is some truth in it. It's the idea that not only a lot of content on the internet, but also a lot of traffic is increasingly automated. It's not actually the work of humans. And there are indications recently that the web, the surviving free parts of the web from the 90s are cracking and dying. Certain protocols and etiquette about the way websites are crawled and searched and indexed. And there's a term called enshittification, which now refers to Google's increasing unreliability. And there's a move to start replacing search engines as we know them with AI bots increasingly. So this combination of automated traffic, automated content, changes of standards, and sort of just shifting tectonic plates under the internet. I know we've got someone here whose book is called Technology is Not the Problem, but I do want to ask whether those developments are at least a challenge in relation to what people are talking about.
Okay, thanks. That was a very useful question. Someone's got the microphone at the back. Can I just see the hands over this side? So there's a question there as well. Yes, go on.
I've got two questions. The first is actually a follow-up to this automation AI question. So what risks do you see, especially for the younger generation, in how they learn what is true, what is not true, how they learn, basically, when there will be so much more aggregated information which they might consider as truth? And then my other question is, I think it's been established censorship is a risk of misinformation. But what else can we actually do, or what should we do, or should we do anything, or is this just something we should be mindful of?
Yes, very good. And there's one final one, well, two, I'll take two more just now. Yes.
I just wanted to say to Dan that as actually happened, what you mentioned about the vaccines, the BBC did do a sort of verify investigation on a vaccine, a family group, or a community of people who'd suffered, and the codes they were using to talk about vaccines, and got that group shut down. So what you said, it has actually happened. And I wanted to link it in with the comment about Bhutan. Both of these, one is the lived experience, and the statement about Bhutan is just a statement, that's all it is, just a fact. But apparently there's a feeling that you can't even say a fact like that. It's considered misinformation, even though it's true. So the most media in this country has a concept of due accuracy, which means, yes, it's true, but you still can't say it. It's not due. So I would like you to talk about that. And also, is there a fact check, an online fact check resource that you trust?
Okay, practical question at the end. When I come back out next time, I'm going to go to the people at the back who wanted to speak, but I'm just going to take one more now.
2 quick points. One, to address Tamandra's point about source. I mean, in this country, the BBC used to be that source, but with the advent of BBC Verify or BBC Pravda, it seems to have sort of diminished its own relevance in that sense. And then the other thing about the AI automation, a lot of the way these large language models work is that they ingest a huge amount of information about a particular topic. And if a lot of people have essentially spouted bollocks about that topic and someone has come up with something opposite, the opposite point of view, if it's in the minority, won't get as much weight as the stuff that is the huge volume of rubbish. So, for instance, if we think back centuries, there might have been lots of people saying that the sun went round the earth, and then Copernicus comes along and actually, no, that's wrong, but he wouldn't get a voice in those large language models now, even though he was right.
Yes. Okay. Where shall I come first? Nico, on the automated question that's raised at the front there, because I thought your kind of historical sort of the stages of historical progress and the problems that throws up in society was very useful. But is this question about, is there just a degree of difference now? We've gone somewhere that is genuinely problematic that wasn't in the historically with the throwing up of things like the printing press or
Well, sure, yeah. Yeah, I think my answer here will get to the two questions, not only the question about automation, but also the question about solutions. These technological developments, they're tools. They're tools that we can use to discover truth. If we were having this conversation 50, 100 years ago, we would present our opinion, and you guys would have nothing to check it in real time. Right now, all of you have a phone in your pocket by which you can fact check us. If you don't trust Google, you can go to a different source. During the Vietnam War, right, there was misinformation then surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin. In the early 2000s, we had weapons of mass destruction. Now we have more tools to check the gatekeepers who may be profiters of misinformation. So it's on us to develop the media literacy, to be skeptical, and to use the tool at our disposal to check that information, and to be credulous also of these tools and their ability to help us, right? Maybe they aren't super helpful, but they're better than what the alternative was 100 years ago, which might have been the encyclopedias on your bookshelf or what you saw coming from 4 channels on the television. So I think media literacy and just helping people figure out what tools are necessary to determine truth for themselves is a good development, even if there are limitations to them.
Dan, anything that you want to chip in on?
Just on the question of what we should do, I think there's a tendency when we confront a problem in society to think that there must be some sort of top-down technocratic solution to that problem. But I would say in a democracy, you've got agency, and there's lots of bullshit out there and false and misleading claims, and I think you've got a responsibility often to try and call those out, and you can do that within a sort of broader cultural context. But I would also say, I mean, one of the really important things about this broader conversation is in complex modern societies, you do need experts and you do need well-functioning institutions like professional journalism, like science, like public health authorities, and so on. And that's so important. And so one challenge is building trust in those institutions. And the most important aspect of that is making those institutions more trustworthy. Like, clearly there are many problems, there have been many faults and failures with those institutions, but there's not really any alternative in complex modern societies to having those institutions. And I do worry sometimes that in the sort of misinformation industry discourse, there's this optimistic view that you can just junk all of that and do your own research. And that's just not going to work in complex modern societies. So I think in terms of an overall systemic solution, we have to build more trustworthy institutions.
Okay. Fraser, anything that you want to pick up on? But there was the question on the Online Safety Act and the dangers of that in terms of going back to this legal harms.
Yeah, I'll address that in a sec. There is actually, the Council of Europe has come up with a word for one of the things we've been talking about, which is this idea that things that are true but you shouldn't say them. And they call it malinformation. So true but misleading, and it's from a paper called Information Disorder. Again, you can see that they're slightly panicked by that. Again, vaccines being the classic example of, and you know, it's obviously true that if you have, you know, if you follow one person on Twitter, X, and the only thing they post is every time someone dies from a vaccine, that would give you a misleading impression. Of course it would. But, you know, how on earth you would go about censoring that or suppressing that, you know, without opening up a whole can of worms. Online Safety Act, yeah, almost certainly. This principle that social media firms should ban legal but harmful material will come back in, particularly post riots. It's quite a scary prospect, really, because obviously it's very difficult. How is legal but harmful defined, or how is it going to be defined? Well, basically, the Minister of Culture will have a list of things that they consider, and it can be changed without parliamentary approval. So whoever's in charge of the DCMS at the time will get to say, these things are harmful, they're not illegal, we can't be bothered to write a law against them, we can't be bothered to, let's not have a debate about whether these things should be censored, but I'm going to put them on my list. So, yeah, that is a very, very deeply worrying thing, you know, the idea that anyone could be held to account legally for something that's not illegal takes us into this quite strange world.
Okay, Eli, anything? But
Yep.
I thought you might have a bite also at this question of a new period of a new era of automation and the consequences of that.
Well, Alexandre de Moraes and the Supreme Court certainly are enthusiastic about using new technology to censor even more Brazilians, that's for sure. But I wanted to comment on that lady's question on whether we can trust any fact-checkers. I do, actually. I do trust some fact-checkers. Those that came way before this wave of the Poynter Institute fact-checking. Those who dedicated themselves to rumors, you know, and they are very useful, you know. I have people in my family who believe very outlandish things on vaccines, and I do respect fact-checkers, but not the new wave of fact-checkers. I think fact-checking is something that is internal to journalism, and it's very weird to dismember it into a new thing to me. And on science, in a previous life, I used to be a biologist, and many people don't remember that the theory of evolution was co-discovered by Alfred Russel Wallace. And one thing that Wallace did that even a fewer number of people will remember is that he once proved that the Earth was not flat on a challenge to a gentleman. And at the time, it was viewed as beyond the pale for a gentleman to dedicate himself to such matters. It was not looked upon kindly. And it's weird. Why? I think we should prove again and again that the Earth is round. Why not? And the flat earthers now, we have very interesting, I think there is a new documentary on a flat earther who changed his mind. Would he do so if he were censored? I think he would just stick to it, right? So free speech is important. It has this epistemological role as well.
Very good. Yes. Spandra.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd also like to talk about the Online Safety Act and legal but harmful, because I think it's a bad act altogether, and the reason for that is that it starts off from a really crazy position, which is instead of making an act to protect children, which is, you know, an absolutely fair enough thing to do, some people wanted to make the whole internet safe, which is why it's called the Online Safety Act. And there was this air of, you can't make the real world safe, but we can make the internet safe if we police it enough, which clearly is nuts. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. You can't make the internet safe any more than you can make the real world safe. Although, also, we should bear in mind that stuff that happens on the internet is not happening to you physically. It may be connected to stuff that will then happen to you physically, but somebody, even if 300 people send you nasty messages on Twitter or X, horrible as that would be, it's not the same as walking down the street with 300 people shouting at you, because then there's a physical threat. And the idea that you can classify something as legal but harmful, so it's not against the law, but it's bad for you in some way, so we're going to, in an undefined way, tell social media companies that they have to remove it, because that's how it would work. It puts a completely undefined duty of care onto companies for content that other people are posting on their platform, which is only going to lead to more censorship from them, because if social media companies are risking being fined or being taken down, or things like have happened in Brazil, they're going to err on the side of caution on the whole. And this brings back to the much earlier point about private censorship. And I think this is a great example of something that you should have the right to do in law, but maybe normatively you shouldn't do it. So if you have a privately owned platform, which is in some senses a platform for public debate, then yes, you should have the right to exclude people from it. You should have the right to say, well, that's outside of what we're talking about here, or this is outside our basic rules of engagement. But should you, in an era where a lot of public debate does happen on privately owned platforms, should you not have a commitment to open debate in the best possible conditions for having open public debate? And should you not do everything in your power to make that possible? I mean, to use the analogy of this room, if some people rushed in and started making such noise and chaos in the balcony that it became impossible to have this discussion, then Alistair would take action and say, no, be quiet, and if you can't be quiet, we'll get you out, in order to carry on the debate. But the purpose of that is to have the free and open debate, whereas he's not saying, oh no, sorry, you can't say that because we don't approve of that opinion. And I think that is how private platforms ought to act. Now, should there be a law forcing them to do that? No. But ought they to do that on a moral basis? Yes.
Okay, so last round of questions, I'm afraid. So stick your hands up high so I can see them. So we've got one down here to start with. Anyone else? Sorry. Yes, go on.
Hi, Neil Hanby. In the pursuit of truth, we either turn to the data or other evidence. And when that's not necessarily possible or still in dispute, we ultimately turn to the courts for a judgment to decide, based on the available facts, what the circumstances are. And that in a democracy, in a functioning democracy, is an essential component of how we organise society. And it's been increasingly difficult, I'm speaking from a Scottish perspective here, but do have some reflections on what's happening down south with the Starmer administration. We've had an increasingly authoritarian administration, initially under Nicola Sturgeon's leadership, with a lack of a separation of the pillars of democracy, because the judiciary element sits on the administration's, the executive cabinet, and the power that's exercised over the legislature is significant as well. So there's a real problem there in that the power is concentrated in the executive, and certainly that's, I think, a fair assessment, but actually I think there's plenty of evidence of that. In fact, that's what's happening. And it's really very worrying, because there's a variety of different situations where that has become deeply problematic for individuals. And we're seeing a similar thing down south now with the Starmer administration, and again, a very passive legislature, a very powerful executive, and a significant influence, not necessarily to the same extent as in Scotland, but into the judiciary, particularly with some of the sentencing after the recent online comments. So I just wonder, what do we do and where do we go when that fundamental principle of a democracy is under very real threat. It's being undermined and eroded by the very people who should be wielding the power that they have with great care and attention. I just wonder what the panel think about that as an issue.
Yes, I think it's, and it's also a consequence of the broader sort of shift to online control and misinformation control as well. You wanted to ask a question yourself, and I really want you to do that.
Yes, so this is more of like a point than a question, because I do know
whatever,
that
yeah.
someone has written a book saying technology is not the problem on the board, and I have a bit of an opposing view as someone who does use like social media and obviously technology. So I think that especially as this is called misinformation, I don't think that the specific misinformation is the issue, but more that technology is making it go out to a much wider audience, because this is a bit interlinked points that I think have been already reviewed already, but I think that if someone were to make a rally and then say something that could be considered harmful in real life but not on the internet, imagine if, I don't know, 1.4 million people commented to that saying I support that, I agree with that, or they just thumbs up as you would on social media. That wouldn't really be deemed as acceptable, but just because people see that it's anonymous, you're sitting behind a screen, people would deem it to be not real. It's still very real, there's still people there. It just doesn't validate it as some people would think it doesn't.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one last point, I think, from someone that's got the microphone. Then I'm going to come back to the panel for what will be final thoughts, so kind of 90 seconds from each of you on something to take away, which actually might usefully reflect on the question we've just had. But yes.
Yeah, obviously the question that's being asked in different ways is who will fact-check the fact-checkers? It's an age-old dilemma. People lie. Sometimes wittingly and sometimes unwittingly. It's as old as humanity. The new concern about misinformation, disinformation, as has been said in many different ways, is a highly selective concern. I mean, there was a mention made here of the 1993, JFK film, which, rehearsed this ludicrous conspiracy theory, which, was kind of promoted around the world. And you could give so many other examples from books and films and television and news and, misinformation, disinformation, lies, inaccuracy, prejudices, bias. It's just a very human thing. And now, obviously, I don't believe we should just sort of throw our hands up. I believe in the pursuit of truth and a shared pursuit of truth. So, at the risk of asking a very simplistic question, who is getting this right? Where are they getting this right? What are the good examples?
Okay, thank you very much. Big, challenging question to finish with. So let's just get a few final thoughts. I think we've got time for about 90 seconds from each of you. Should we just go along the line, starting with Dan?
Maybe just on that final point, what I'd say is there's so much doom and gloom about social media today, about misinformation and so on, how it can spread so quickly. And I think, as you say, a lot of that is a little bit historically illiterate. But I'd go further and say there's never been a time when there's a greater diversity of viewpoints in the public sphere, able to express a greater diversity of views, and that's a fantastic thing. And I think what social media has done in some ways has sort of maximized the variance when it comes to the quality of information. So you get really crap stuff, but you also get really fantastic stuff in the modern age of social media and the internet. And there are loads of high quality, data-driven sources. Just to mention one, I was sort of slagging off news media earlier, but if you want to get an evidence-based picture of the world, something like Our World in Data, fantastic, incredible resource for informing you about the way the world is today. And there are loads of outlets, loads of voices online that provide a far more rigorous evidence-based picture of reality than you would have got in the 90s or the 80s from traditional media. So I think even though there are problems, there's far too much doom and gloom, I think, about the kind of informational situation we're in today.
Yes, good. Nico?
Well, I feel like as the lone American up in this panel, I should respond to the JFK conspiracy theories. I mean, my father-in-law bless him, he's a great man, although he loves conspiracy theories. He is an expert on the JFK assassination and says, no, the narrative, the popular narrative is the correct narrative, and he'll spend 3 hours talking to you about why that is so. But this gets to the earlier point I was making about how misinformation can become ripe when the landscape for the discourse is omitting certain things. And I think one of the reasons you get this conspiracy theories around the JFK assassination is that people know that there are JFK files that haven't been released, right? They were supposed to be released during the Trump administration, and then the Trump administration said, no, there are some files we can't release. So of course people are gonna be like, well, what's in those files? Why aren't they gonna release it? And they probably have very good reason for not wanting to release those. I don't know. But you could see how that would supercharge a conspiracy theory, right? The more access that we feel we have to all the information that is available to inform a discussion, the more we are going to trust, again, that public discourse. I also want to respond to Tamandra as a last point about can but should, right? With regard to private institutions. I think you're 100% right. I think any institution that is committed to truth-seeking, and our colleges and universities are largely committed to truth-seeking. Public colleges and universities in the United States are bound by the First Amendment, right? So they have to allow for the free exchange of ideas, but private universities do not have to. Harvard's motto is veritas, truth. It hasn't always lived up to that motto, but FIRE will hold them to account because that is what they say they are going to do. On the other hand, you have universities like Yeshiva or Brigham Young universities. These are sectarian religious universities that place other values above freedom of speech, and we're going to allow their free association right to do so. Talking about private social media companies, you have Twitter, where the founders said they were the free speech wing of the free speech party, and this is the world stage for public discourse. Well, they didn't live up to that, so you can see why people would call them out for it. Well, you know, you can also have social media platforms like Farmers Only, where it's like, it's a dating site only for farmers, right? That's the beauty of a pluralistic society, is that you can associate around different values. But if you say you're for truth-seeking, if you say you're for free speech like Twitter did, then you should live up to those values. But I agree, it shouldn't be enshrined in law.
Thank you very much. Tamandra.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a more hopeful note here. So just to respond to the person who said, no, actually technology is a problem because of the scale and the speed at which things can be shared. So something in itself isn't a problem, can be shared at scale and at speed. That is true, and that is the nature of the new, the social media landscape rather than the top-down landscape. But the strength of it is that it is relatively democratic. Anybody can try and get something out there. And yes, we don't always have the algorithms on our side, but remember the algorithms they're aiming to maximize engagement. The algorithms are responding to us responding to things. So if the algorithms spread things that encourage polarization and angry responses, that's because that's what we're responding to. So in a sense, it's on us to change that response. Broadly, I think the answer to this is the pluralistic landscape. And actually, if you look at previous attempts to censor and control mainstream media, the Leveson report and so on, when they said, no, we must control what the media do, then the quickest thing to counter that was to point to cases where actually the worst things that media outlets had done were called out by other media outlets. So what you need is a plurality of media outlets from a plurality of points of view, and that is the best check on the worst excesses of any one. And the answer really is that institutions like the media, like other institutions, I agree with Dan on this, need to be more trustworthy. And part of that is to admit the possibility they may be wrong, to not let anything go out that's too good to check. And I think we can all be guilty of this. You find something that proves every point you've already thought, and you share it without checking. And those are exactly the things you need to check. Not the things you disagree with. You need to check the things you agree with before you pass them on. And to admit uncertainty. And that's what I think media and other institutions need to do, is when things are uncertain, they need to admit uncertainty and not try and narrow the narrative to just one thing.
Okay, Eli.
Yeah, so to the question on who is doing it right. So I did praise America for its free speech standard. I think it's a beacon to the world in that sense. But it wasn't in the pandemic. So who did it right in the pandemic? Sweden. Sweden did it right. No lockdowns, no mandates. But Sweden is weird compared to most societies because there's a high level of trust of the people on its government. And how can I trust a government that tried 4 times now to establish a Ministry of Truth? how can I trust Supreme Court that has as its emperor a judge who quotes John Stuart Mill to justify censorship and banning a whole social media platform? So it's hard to trust. And I think the Bitcoin bros are right. Decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. That's what we need to do. So, and that is something deep about that, because I've translated this book. It's a philosophy of science book by Susan Hack. She's a Brit, but she lives in America. And the title is Defending Science Within Reason. And the main theory is science is the long arm of common sense. Because common sense is decentralized thinking. It's multiple heads thinking what the world is really like. And science comes from that, in her view. So I think not only science, democracy comes from that. And good rules come from that too.
Thanks, Ely. Fraser, final word to you.
Yeah, I think a lot of talk about trust in institutions and democracy and things like that. I think, obviously the two things it's really important, but one of the great ironies, of course, is the mistrusted institutions, every move they make to try and regain our trust ends up backfiring spectacularly and ends up reminding us why we don't trust them. And I think, the misinformation panic is such a classic version of that. The worst thing the BBC ever did was create BBC Verify, because it made people think, well, weren't you checking facts before? I'll leave it at that.
Can we thank the panel, please?